A lot of different ways that we can start looking at 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. But in most of the time, I like to get the background information as we actually go through the book. But in this case, I want us to turn to the book of Acts. Because when you're reading through the book of Acts on Paul's second missionary journey, in fact, just a quick review, what chapters do you associate the first missionary journey with in the book of Acts? How long ago has it been since you studied the book of Acts? Has it been a while? There are a few chapters. In fact, one of the things these guys have to do for a final that I'm just saying this because I have found this so beneficial in my own life, is their final is going to be, I'm going to tell them information, they just have to tell me where it is in the Bible. Because so many times, if you know the Jerusalem Council's Acts chapter 15, if you know man kicked out of the church at Corinth is 1 Corinthians chapter 5, if you know Great White Throne Judgment is Revelation chapter 20, if you just know things like some of the basic big things. 10 Commandments are found in 2 different places in the Old Testament. They're found where? Exodus chapter 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 5. Excellent. It makes me proud. When you know things like that, it just helps, because when you're talking to people, you don't always have the advantage of, well, let me look that up here, or I know it's in there somewhere. You can say, well, that's in Exodus chapter 20. Let's just flip over there right now. Let's look at that. Well, when you're looking at the book of Acts, a huge portion of the book of Acts will be the missionary journeys in the book of Acts, right? So when you think of the first missionary journey, which 2 chapters do you usually come to mind? If chapter 15 is the Jerusalem Council, that kind of sets off the first and second missionary journey. So we usually think of chapters 13 and 14 as being the first missionary journey. So after chapter 15, what is the Jerusalem Council all about, by the way? Okay, you could use the word circumcision. If you had to use one word, that'd be an appropriate word to use. It's the idea of law versus grace. It's the idea, do people who become Christians, do they have to become Jews first? And that was pivotal in our understanding of the entire book of Romans and the entire book of Galatians. In fact, some of us think that Galatians was written as a result of what took place in Acts chapter 15. If not a direct result of that, it's definitely covering the same ground. So anyway, Paul, by the way, who was his major traveling companion on the first missionary journey? Barnabas. Paul and Barnabas. Paul and Barnabas on the first missionary journey come back to Jerusalem to give their report. And they give the report of how many Gentiles became Christians. And that's part of what we're talking about. Do these Gentiles have to become Jews first? No, they don't. But one of the things that happened on the first missionary journey is it wasn't just Paul and Barnabas. There was somebody else traveling with them. Who else was traveling with them? Silas. Paul, Barnabas, and there was a guy who wrote a lot. He was later on, Peter would use him as a scribe to write for him. What was his name?
John Mark.
John Mark. John Mark. And what notable thing did John Mark do during the first missionary journey?
Bail.
That's exactly right. It's kind of like, for some reason or another, this is too tough. I'm going home. And so he did, which is so interesting because Paul, who seems to be quite hard on John Mark for bailing, for giving up before the first missionary journey is over, later on, even though he's quite hard on him to begin with, later on, he specifically mentions what a great help John Mark is to him. But nonetheless, there was a growing process there. Why am I bringing this up? Because after the Jerusalem Council, when they think it's fitting, hey, let's go back and revisit those churches and keep going on, taking the message to other places, but they wanted to go back and revisit some of the churches. When they did that, Barnabas says, yeah, let's get John Mark again. And what does Paul say? Burn me once. It's not exactly right out of the Bible, but the basic idea was, hey, I'm not doing that again. Guy bailed on me the first time. I'm not taking him on this second trip. And there was the way it's translated to most, I think the New American Standard is, there was such a sharp disagreement, huge disagreement. They didn't resolve this. I'm glad that's in the Bible, because you know what? Every issue you face, you're not going to be able to resolve it. Non-biblical issues. When God speaks about something, you can resolve. But interpersonal relationships, you know what? Some people are just going to be Gator fans. There's nothing you can do. I said that because I know some married couples are Seminole versus Gator and stuff like that. Anyway, there are just some issues, some disagreements that we're going to have. But I always like this expression. As Christians, you have to agree to disagree. You have to disagree in an agreeable way. And the blessing in this one was Barnabas decides to go one direction and visit some of the churches to take the message. And Paul gets a new traveling companion for the second missionary journey. And who would that be?
Silas.
Silas is his major companion here. Now, there's some other people that travel along with them too. Can you remember who these other people are that travel along with them? One of them was Timothy. His name was Timothy. Sorry, it was an inside joke. Timothy, and who else? Did you understand that inside joke? Do you know what we mean when we say a Timothy? A Timothy is somebody that you have been training, somebody that you help bring to the Lord, and you're training, you're discipling them so that they can be an effective minister. Right?
Because of Timothy?
Yes, that's where we get the expression from, because what Paul did with Timothy, we talk about Timothying somebody, being a Timothy. So, I'm sorry, that was silly. Anyway, but he was one of the traveling companions, so you got Paul and Silas, which, by the way, what's the other, Paul's previous name was what? Saul. He goes by Paul after his conversion. That's what he wants to be known by. Silas also has another name, and this goes to whether you're going to approach him from the Latin perspective, and why would the Latin perspective come into play in the first century? Rome, the Romans, it's a Roman world, that's Latin. That was the language of the Roman Empire, it's Latin. We all the time talk about Hebrew and Greek was the international language, that's true. But don't forget the Latin influence from Rome. We don't talk about that very often. Either the Latin influence or the Hebrew, from the Hebrew perspective, depending on which perspective, you know what? Let me double check that because I might be telling you wrong. It's either the Latin perspective or the Greek. He is a Hebrew from the Hebrew perspective, but whether you're talking about him from the Greek perspective or the Latin perspective, you're either going to call him Silas or Silvanus. That's exactly right. So depending on which perspective you're getting, you're going to use a different name there, but it's the same guy. So when you run it across Silvanus versus Silas, just remember that, because sometimes some translations don't always make that distinction or bring that to your attention. Okay, so for the second missionary journey, it's Paul and Silas mainly, right? They've also got Timothy, and who else? Who wrote the book of Acts? Luke. And there's some really interesting, I find this kind of stuff fascinating myself. But as you're reading along, there are passages, especially on the second missionary journey, where Luke's saying, and we did this, and we did that, and they did this, and they did that. And so it's kind of like, oh, Luke's not with them anymore. And then it's we again. And so it's kind of like, okay, Luke's back in the journey again with them. And one of the breaks that takes place, by the way, is this portion that we're going to be looking at here with Thessalonians. Okay, second missionary journey. Second missionary journey starts in chapter 16. In chapter 16 of the book of Acts is mainly focused on one town. What town is Acts chapter 16 focused on? It is one of the towns in Macedonia. It's one of the churches. By the way, when I say Macedonia, what do you think about Macedonia? There's references made to this region. What do we know about this region in the first century? Paul says something to it to the church at Corinth, which is down in Achaia. He says, listen, that region up there, those people there, they're what?
Asia Minor?
No, Asia, actually Asia in the first century would be to the north and to the east of what we're talking about. We're talking about Macedonia up here in the north, and this area where Athens and Corinth are, that would be Achaia.
Does he say they're kind of like barbaric or something?
No, not barbaric. I'm not doing a very good job of leading here. What he says is they're poor.
Yeah, poor.
They're poor. And yet out of their poverty, remember he talks about this, he says these people are the last place you'd expect to get a lot of offerings from. And guess what? They're the people most eager to give.
Wow.
Most eager to give. And one of the churches that Paul refused to receive offerings from would be Corinth. but one of the churches that he always received offerings from. He talks about them giving to him and him receiving their gifts at critical times would be one of these churches in Macedonia. Which church would that be?
Ephesus?
Not Ephesus.
Philippi?
Philippi. Philippi is Acts chapter 16. Okay, I'm kind of glad we're doing this just for purpose of overview. When you look at Acts chapter 16, and you're mainly focused on Philippi, there are three major characters, not in the book of Philippians. Book of Philippians, the 4 chapters over there, but when the historical picture is presented to us, there are three major events, three major characters that you find there in Philippi. When he first comes to Philippi, one of the interesting things we find out is probably not a lot of Jews in Philippi. Why do we think that?
No synagogue?
No synagogue. That's exactly right. There was this. There had to be 10 families, 10 heads of families before you establish a synagogue. They didn't have that many Jews. So when you didn't have that many Jews, where did they usually meet? Usually by a body of water. And so Paul goes outside of town looking for Jews, if there are any Jews meeting together. And he happens to find a group of Jews. And there's an interesting prominent woman who's involved in trade, who's probably very supportive of a lot of things going on there because the kind of trade she's involved in. Who is this woman? Lydia. And what kind of trade is she involved in? Purple. Selling her purple, that's exactly right. Do they receive the message well when Paul comes and tells them about, hey, this Messiah you're looking for, he's actually come? How do you know they receive the message well? Well, I'm taking it if you get baptized, you believe what you're hearing. It's kind of like, okay, leave that life behind. Here's a brand new life I'm starting. That was well understood, the significance of baptism. So that's what happens with Lydia. That's the first major character you meet in Philippi. Who's the second major character? Always think of these three major characters. It's Lydia, and the next one's a young person, a young girl. Can you tell me about this young girl? This young girl's following Paul and Silas around.
Oh,
What's she doing following around? What's she saying?
Isn't she demon possessed?
Yes! In fact, the people who own her, slave girl, right? They're making a lot of money off the fact that through her demon possession, she can tell things that other people don't know. So they're using her for fortune-telling purposes, right? Well, she's following Paul and Silas around saying, these guys are really from the Most High God. Well, now, that's kind of an endorsement, isn't it? That's kind of like, hey, yeah, that's true. What she's saying is right. Why does Paul not want her saying that?
You don't want that because of what she is.
Yes. You know what? If I have no idea who the biggest producer of pornography is, but whoever that is, if they came out next week and said, man, we just love my church. You know what? We'd be saying, would you just keep your mouth shut?
Yeah.
we don't want an endorsement from you. You understand what I'm saying? There's certain sources you don't want that from. And so, especially when demonic possession's involved. So what does Paul do? He drives the demon out. That's exactly right. And what do the owners of this girl think? Oh, wait a minute. That's where we were making all of our money. That's exactly right. And so they complain about it. In what way do they complain? We want these guys punished. In fact, they're flogged and they're thrown in jail, which leads us to the third major character that they meet in Philippi. First one's Lydia. Second one's the little girl. Who's the third one? Jailer. And you remember the experience with the jailer, right? At midnight, they're singing hymns, right? And there's the great earthquake, the chains fall off and everything, and the jailer thinks that all of his prisoners have escaped, he's going to kill himself. And Paul and Silas say, no. You know, they're singing hymns thinking that they might well die, but when this guy's getting ready to kill himself, it's kind of like, you're not ready to die yet, right? And so what happens to the Philippian jailer? He wants to know, what can I do to be saved? But what can I do to have the kind of confidence you guys obviously have, right? So he's told to believe in Jesus in that very hour of the night. They take him out, he and his whole family, who believed, by the way. So they had to be old enough to believe, right? He and his whole family were baptized that very night. That's what takes place in Philippi. When Paul and Silas leave Philippi, I did this for a reason. He's going to mention what happened to him at Philippi. Remember what happens to him at Philippi. He is mistreated. And by the way, I didn't quite finish that off. After the release from prison, right? The next morning, the magistrate comes and says, well, you guys can go, right? Everybody's temper is calmed down a little bit, just leave town. And what does Paul say to him? I'm not just going to leave town. Why? Because what you did wasn't right, because...
Roman citizen.
Was it right to flog a Roman citizen for everybody? What does the magistrate say?
Ooh.
You were a Roman citizen? Yeah, he's... By the way, why... I find this very significant. It's significant the fact that God mentions it in the Bible. But what's so significant about that? Probably several things. But why is Paul digging his heels in on a situation like this? I'm not just going to slip out of town. No, you're going to have to publicly say, you know what? We mistreated these guys, and what they did's okay. You know, we were in the wrong, not them. Why does he want a public apology like that?
Better
Vindication.
endorsement?
Okay, vindication, endorsement, I'll go with that on a minor level. I'll accept that, but I don't think that's the major reason.
Just to show that there are rights and wrongs.
I'll accept that on a minor level, but not the major level either. Okay, let me ask it this way. What's the major reason Paul's visiting Philippi in the first place?
Start churches.
He wants to start a church. So when Paul leaves town, who's still there?
People.
The church. That's exactly right. So if Paul slips out of town, you know, scared out of town, what's it going to mean to the people who have to stay in town? Man, persecution. They persecuted Paul, they're going to persecute us. But if Paul comes back and says, hey, you can't treat me that way, what difference is that going to make for the church that stays there?
Well, now they owe him, so they can't touch his people.
You know what? It's going to make life a little bit easier. It's going to make a difference for the Christians who have to stay in Philippi. Does that make sense? You know, what you did was wrong in the way you treated us. And you have to publicly apologize and acknowledge that. So now I can leave town, and it's going to make life at least a step or two easier for the people who stay in Philippi. Okay, that happens. Paul's going to make reference to what happens at Philippi, because the next place he goes, passes through a couple of towns, and comes to the biggest city in the area. Biggest city in the area? Thessalonica. This is it.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Which area are we talking about?
We are talking about Macedonia. This is the area of Macedonia, and the three major places we think of, because Acts chapter 16 would be Philippi. Chapter 17 is Thessalonica, Berea, and down here in Athens. Okay? Now, he's going to go on in chapter 18 to Corinth. But these are the three that you think in chapter 17. This is chapter 16 of the book of Acts. So turn to chapter 17, because the first part of chapter 17 is going to talk about Thessalonica. And I want us to make a couple parallels, okay? So keep your hand here in Acts chapter 17, and your other hand over in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1. We'll get both of these side by side. No, I'm not in either one. Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, Acts chapter 17. Acts chapter 17, and then if you've got 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 marked, here's what we're going to do. Let's start here. You look in verse 1, he's just left Philippi. He passes through Amphipolis and Apollonia, and then they come to Thessalonica. It says in verse 1, where there was a Jewish synagogue. Oh, what does that tell you? Jewish synagogue. Okay, at least a presence of Jews there, unlike Philippi. So Philippi is really going to be, by the way, when I think of Philippi, I think of retired military.
Really?
Yeah, because Philippi was one of the major areas where it was possible for the Roman soldiers, and it was very favorable for them. And so you have a strong presence there of Roman citizens. Anyway, Thessalonica would be the most populated city in this area. It was so large that they allowed them to print their own money.
Whoa.
And so we actually have coins and things like that from Thessalonica. The Roman Empire didn't allow that for everybody, but it was a major area. So this is like coming to, I don't know, going through some state and stopping in the most populated city in that state, right? So you're going through the region, and that you come to Thessalonica. There's a presence of Jews here. We know that because there's a synagogue in verse 1. However, we also know that there's a lot of Gentiles, and we're going to find out who responds. It says in verse 2, as was his custom, Paul went to the synagogue, And on 3 Sabbath days, so it'd be 3 weeks, right? Because the Sabbath day is which day of the week? Saturday, thank you. He went on 3 Sabbath days and he reasoned with them from the scriptures. Doesn't this just sound like what Jesus did to the two in the road to the Emmaus? They couldn't understand what happened to Jesus, and he started and he explained all the scriptures to them. If you understood the scriptures, you'd understand that I had to suffer, had to die, and I'd raise from the dead. By the way, this whole idea of Jesus dying on the cross and raising from the dead, what the preaching of the cross, what's that called? It's called foolishness to the Gentiles, and what's it called to the Jews? Stumbling block. That doesn't, our Messiah, that can't happen to him. Right? That messes them up. And so Jesus explained to the ones on Emmaus, if you really understood the Bible, this wouldn't mess you up. You'd get this. It's exactly what Paul's doing. He's saying, let me go over the verses you already heard. You already know these prophecies. Let me read them to you again, and let me explain them to you again, because I'm telling you, this shouldn't be a stumbling block. This ought to make perfect sense. They all point to Jesus. Right? So that's what he's doing here in the synagogues in the synagogue at Thessalonica for 3 Sabbaths, right? Explaining the scriptures to them, explaining and proving that Christ had to suffer and rise from the dead. This is exactly what Jesus was talking in Luke 24 to the two on the road to Emmaus. This Jesus I proclaim to you is my translation says Christ, but what does Christ mean? Messiah. He's talking to these Jews saying, here's your Messiah. If you understood these scriptures, you would realize this the Christ, the Messiah, he said. Some of the Jews, verse 4, were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number. Now, I don't want to make too much of this, but I want to read this again. This is the NIV, and it says, some of the Jews. Well, how much is some? Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's just a gunshot. Shotgunning it, right? It's
Right,
just,
right.
you don't know exactly. But when it says some of the Jews were persuaded, as did a large number of the God-fearing Greeks, what does that kind of imply? Was there more Greeks or more Jews?
More Greek.
It really kind of implies there were more Gentiles responding than there were Jews, which, by the way, we're going to find out in a minute is very likely. But notice what he says. Some of the Jews respond, as did a large number. By the way, what is a God-fearing Greek? Versus the non-God-fearing Greek, I know. But what is a God-fearing Greek? Okay, it would be the ones who, by the way, where has he been preaching for 3 weeks? At the synagogue. Well, how's he going to reach a bunch of Gentiles at the synagogue?
Gentiles that are trying to be Jews.
Okay, these are the ones that wanted to follow and wanted to find out and were drawn to the God of the Jews. They just didn't want to become Jews yet.
Oh, really?
They were either in process, some of them were in process, referred to many different designations, sometimes seekers, God-fearers, still Gentiles, hadn't become Jews yet, but they were drawn to the God of the Jews. Okay, so they would have been there, and some of the Jews responded, a lot of those God-fearing Greeks. This was like, wow, this was exactly what we've been looking for, right? And notice who else is designated here. And a few prominent women. Prominent women. I find this so interesting. The Bible never shies away from drawing attention to women, which normally wouldn't happen in the first century. I was shocked to learn in my early ministry, well, a long time ago, I was preaching in Tennessee. At that time, I have no idea today, but at that time, other than the few billionaires that are out there, as far as the mass of wealth held in the United States of America, there were some statistics and studies done that I was made aware of. This is like 25 years ago, 30 years ago. It was widow women in the United States who held
Wow.
most of the wealth of the United States at that time. And I'm like, wow, isn't that interesting?
You sound
Well,
prominent.
and that's just an interesting aside, but quite frequently in Jesus' ministry, for example, he received support, and the Bible tells us sometimes it was from women who had money, such as John Mark's mother, right? There are some women that are mentioned at different times. These women, prominent women, were probably women not only of position or married to the men who held prominent positions there in Thessalonica, which was the biggest city in the area, right? Or women of money and influence. Anyway, it says in verse 5, but the Jews were jealous. So you get this, some Jews respond, here are all the people that have been hanging around the synagogue, and an awful lot of them are turning Christian. It's like, what? They're following Paul and Silas. So instead of being happy about this, they're jealous. So they rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace. I like this translation. They got these unscrupulous guys from the marketplace and formed a mob and started a riot in the city. They rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas in order that they would bring him out of the crowd. By the way, I've got to make this comment. Have you ever heard the term mudslinging? Do you know what mudslinging is in a debate setting? It's okay. If your opponent has just nailed you to the wall with logic, he has made a point that you can't respond to, and you don't have anything to say logically, you resort to, often in debate, mudslinging. What that means is you attack their character, or you bring up something that it really has nothing to do with what you're talking about, but it's something derogatory you can say. Why? Because you're so upset. Here's the way this happens. Here's I'm sorry, this is the one that always kind of comes to mind. There was a gentleman in a church I started a long time ago, sweet older man, but he never was able to kick the habit of smoking. He just really had this problem with smoking. And he was talking about a preacher of his church that he went to before. He says, that preacher, almost every Sunday he talked about smoking. And I'm like, yeah. And he said, and he was fat. You know what he was doing? That's called mudslinging. The idea is, okay, I really don't have an answer for why I'm smoking it, and I probably shouldn't, but you know what? That guy's fat. So you understand what's going on? Okay, I'm sorry. I really am not off track, in my mind anyway. Because what the Jews were doing was, when they couldn't answer Paul's arguments, because what was Paul doing? He was showing them from the scripture, this is your Messiah. And some of the Jews responded, a lot of the Greeks did, and the Jews who didn't respond appropriately, what'd they do? Let's go hire some guys to really make life miserable for them. It's not like, let's go back to the Bible and try to prove them wrong. Couldn't do that.
Let's go converse with bad people.
Yeah. Don't tell me the truth because, I might be convinced. I don't want to hear the truth. I just want to hold on to my position. That's in essence what they're doing. And they create this mob scene. Okay, flip over to 1 Thessalonians chapter 1. 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, look at verse 9. We're going to get to this a little bit later, but look at verse 9 right now. What does it say? It says, 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 9. For they themselves report what kind of reception that you gave us. He's talking about the Thessalonians. He says, you know what you did? They tell how you turned to God from idols or pagan idols to serve the living, true God. What does that tell you? It tells you that probably most of the converts there before were not the Jews from the synagogue, but were some of the Gentiles who used to be involved in worshiping all sorts of different idols. Right? It kind of makes sense. Let's read a little bit more from Acts chapter 17 here. They hire these guys, they round up some bad characters from the marketplace to start this mob scene. They go to Jason's house. Verse 6, it says, but when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city officials, shouting, these men who have caused trouble all over the world. I always love that verse. What is it? The old King James says, turn the world upside down. They've come here also. Verse 7, and Jason welcomed them into his house. So they were staying with Jason. Jason would be associated with the synagogue there at Thessalonica. And they are defying Caesar's decree, saying that there is another king, one called Jesus. Why do they present it that way? They're trying to stir up a mob scene. That's exactly, so they're trying to get the Roman citizens, all angered, people who normally would say, oh, that's just a religious argument, we don't want to hear anything about it. But now you bring Caesar up, what? These guys are treason and revolt, right? So they mention it that way. Verse 8, when they heard this, the crowd and the city officials were thrown into turmoil, and they made Jason and the others postpone, and they let them go. As soon as it was night, the brothers sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. Okay, so what's going on here? How long do they stay? We're not exactly sure, but we know he was preaching there for 3 weeks. At the end of 3 weeks, some Jews, a lot of Gentiles responded. Some Jews got really upset and made this terrible scene. Had to be there at least 3 weeks, probably not much longer than that. And what happens? They pretty much have to get them out of town for them not to lose their lives, right? Okay, flip over to 1 Thessalonians. Look at chapter 2. Look at chapter 2. And look down at verse 17 with me. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 17. It says, but brothers, when we were torn away from you for a short time in person, but not in thought, out of our intense longing, we made every effort to see you. What does that tell you? It tells you what we read from the book of Acts. They didn't stay in Thessalonica nearly as long as they wanted to. Okay, what would some of the implications of that be? If Paul had to leave town before he wanted to leave town, usually Paul left town after he did enough training, enough discipling, the church is going, that he felt like he could go on to another area. Well, I'm reading in between the lines here, but in all likelihood, Paul didn't want to leave town yet. So what does that tell you about the church at Thessalonica?
You're sipping on
Quite
milk.
established. Yeah.
Probably sipping on milk. Probably, can I say babes in Christ? So if you help disciple somebody and you just, you got them baptized and you're starting to teach them the commands of Jesus, but for some reason they leave the country, they move or whatever, you're going to be a little extra concerned about people like that, right? Not only that, there's one other factor. Let me go back to Jesus, but Paul did the same thing. But when Jesus would deal with sinners, prostitutes, the woman caught in the act of adultery, brought to him and stuff like that, how would you describe Jesus' his method of dealing with people that are the outcasts and the sinners? How did Jesus deal with them?
Merciful.
He was very merciful. Remember the prophecy about a bruised reed he will not break, a smoldering flame he will not put out. He was very compassionate, very patient, very gentle. Still told them with the truth, told them what was right, but he did it in gentleness. How did Jesus deal with the Pharisees and the teachers of the law? Boy, he was kind of like, you know what, I'm not going to be so patient with you guys. And I'm not going to pull any punches with you guys. I'm just going to get right in your face and say, you should have known better, and a little more aggressive and everything. Well, Paul did the same thing. When somebody's a babe in Christ, you know what? You don't beat them up. You deal with them gently, kindly. You focus on, hey, you're doing a good job there, and try to be as positive as you can. Think of that when we get into chapter 1 here, 1 Thessalonians. Chapter 1, chapter 2, notice how many times Paul says, I'm so thankful for you guys. Man, I'm thankful for this. I'm thankful for that. You know what? He didn't have to say that. You and I don't have to say that to one another, but you know what? We probably should. Some things that don't have to be said because it helps build people up, right? Well, he's going to do the same thing, and in large part because it's an infant church. Okay, let's just get into chapter 1 here, and we'll pick up some of the rest of the background as we go through. 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, Paul and Silas. Does your translation say Silas or Silvanus?
Silvanus.
Okay, that's interesting, because sometimes they translate it for you. But we are talking about the same man. And he also mentions Timothy on this occasion. He says, Paul, Silas, and Timothy to the church. Okay, I find this interesting too. I know this is just a general introduction, but he says, to the church of the Thessalonians in God the Father and our Lord Jesus Christ. Okay, notice he doesn't say to the church of Christ at Thessalonica. He doesn't say to the Christian church at Thessalonica. We were told the other day, we were visiting somebody, I'm not going to say who else is involved in the we unless they want to let themselves be known, but we were visiting somebody who said, hey, listen, in Romans the 16th chapter, it says that the church is the Church of Christ. Church of Christ at Rome. Therefore, if you're a church, you ought to call yourself the Church of Christ. Well, you know what? You can call yourself the Church of Christ. That's okay. But you know what? In most of the places in the Bible, you can turn to Romans chapter 16, you can find that. But in most of the places in the Bible, it's going to talk about the church at Philippi, or the church at Thessalonica, or the church. Because what does the word church mean? Yeah, it means the assembly, the group, the family, the assembly of those who are called out from the world to be God's people, right? It's almost redundant to say the Church of Christ, because that's what we're talking about. Sometimes you say that for emphasis' sake, but it is implied in the word if you understand the word. Yeah.
It can also be called the way. They called us that a lot.
They call yes.
These are the people of the way. You know?
There are many different designations.
Yes.
They're called the way. They're called the disciples. Sometimes, where was the first place they were called Christians? Antioch. That's exactly right. But there are many different designations for God's people. I just don't want us to get hung up on, you have to say it this way. Yeah.
I'm not sure if you know this or not, but like the history of the word church, when it was used back then, did anybody elsewhere outside of God's people say we're a church?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. In fact, it was an expression that was used in Matthew chapter 18 before the church was started. Church hasn't even been started yet, and Jesus talks about the church. Why? Because it was a Greek term that was used talking about an assembly of people. In this case, we're talking about an assembly of God's people. Now, you know what the parallel word is to church? The parallel word to church in the plural would be synagogue. So why don't we call it the synagogue in Thessalonica? Because that would be so confusing. Because the synagogue, the assembly, the group that meets together, that's usually, in our minds anyway, associated with the Jewish people. The gathering of the Jewish people. So to differentiate between the synagogue, we're going to use another word which pretty much means the same thing. The assembling together, the meeting together, the grouping together of the people who are trying to be God followers, right? And that would be church. But it was used in Roman literature, for example.
Oh, really?
Yes.
That doesn't have to do with God followers and that.
No, in fact, I love this because William Lane Craig, in his introduction to the Gospel of Mark, talks about Octavius, who we know better by his other name, Augustus, Caesar Augustus. And Caesar Augustus, when he was a young man, Octavius, was tutored, or really adopted, taken in, by a guy named Julius Caesar. Well, Julius Caesar was highly regarded by the people, although there was a large rebellion amongst the people in power. But nonetheless, because of that, Octavius got a nickname. His nickname was the Son of God. Well, Octavius, better known as Augustus, known as the Son of God, was quite stuck on himself because he believed all people were saying that he really was the Son of God. And so one of the things he wanted to do was he wanted everybody to celebrate his birthday in the entire Roman Empire. So he would send out messengers, and the Greek word for messenger is evangel. So he would send out evangelists to proclaim the gospel, which means good news, that today is the Son of God's birthday. Same words that we use in the New Testament, but Caesar Augustus uses those words because there was a gospel just means good news, right? Evangels are those who carry good news, share good news with other people, right? And I find that fascinating. So they use those same terms, yeah.
Just for, while we're on the subject, this is before Jesus?
Augustus, remember Augustus is the one who sends out the decree that a census should be taken.
Oh,
so that
yeah.
Okay, that would be at the birth of Jesus.
Okay.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, it was in that very setting, at that very time, when the Roman world would be very familiar with evangelists and very familiar with gospel.
Okay.
That these things are happening. Yeah. Okay. To the church of the Thessalonians in God, the Father, and our Lord Jesus Christ, grace and peace to you. I know This is a common introduction, but it's just such a powerful way of greeting a church. Because the word grace means what?
Gift.
It simply means a good gift, a gift. Some people talk about it being unmerited favor. I can go with that too. But when we talk about grace, it's shorthand. It's shorthand talking about that's the way we're saved. It's the grace of God, right? The grace of God is the only thing that can lead to true peace. It's the only thing that can lead to true peace. So when he talks about grace and peace to you, that's like in a nutshell what Christianity is all about. Being right with God through Jesus Christ, that's the grace of God. Bringing you peace, making life as it ought to be eternally. Right? So it's a great introduction, and it's fitting that he would say that, and it has so many implications on so many different levels. But after saying that, he gets into the heart of what he wants to say. He's still in his introduction, but notice how positive he is. In fact, I want to emphasize this because remember he's talking to baby Christians. Oh, by the way, I didn't say this. After he leaves Thessalonica, he goes on to Berea. Chapter 17, after verse 10. Remember he leaves, he snuck out of town, and he goes to Berea. Well, I tell you what always jumps out of my mind when I think of Berea. Berea, the Bereans are called more noble than the people in Thessalonica. More noble, better. They did it better. Why? We're told why they were more noble. You remember this? Because when the message was preached to them, the Bereans, the first thing they did is they went home, and they got out the scrolls, and they checked it for themselves. I love that.
Wow.
You know what? Anytime, especially when you hear something you think, I haven't heard that before. You know what? Don't assume it's true. Go home, open up your Bible, check it out, make sure it's right. And that's something that's very pleasing. Anyway, after Berea, then Paul comes down to Corinth, and that's where, he comes down to Athens next. In fact, that was kind of a heartbreaking thing for Paul. He comes in and he's so upset because they have so many idols. In fact, the Greek term there literally means they sunk. They were submerged in idols. It's like they'd gone under, right? And so he preaches that famous sermon on Mars Hill. After Athens, he goes to Corinth, and he stays much longer in Corinth. And this is where Timothy and Luke catch up with him. And this is also where he hears some reports about what's going on in Thessalonica. And in all likelihood, this is where he is when he writes back to the church at Thessalonica. So not very far removed in time. And from what he says here to the church at Thessalonica, he's made more than one effort to try to get back to them. So he's sending this letter to them. He's very concerned. Okay? So, again, to these Christians, he's very concerned about, and for good reason, because he was ripped away from them before he wanted to leave. He says, we always thank God. Oh, by the way, I gotta sorry, but I gotta say this. When he's ripped away from them, torn away, the expression he uses, before he wanted to leave, a lot of people would say, oh yeah, but that's the will of God. Do you think the Apostle Paul would have said that? I mean, everything that happens, it's got to be God's will, right?
So many people say that.
No. In fact, one of the things Paul's going to talk to the church at Thessalonica about is, you know what? Satan is alive and well. And Satan is doing some things in this world. And so it's not necessarily what God wanted to happen, but maybe part of Satan's attack was to get Paul out of there sooner than he went to. Don't always jump to the conclusion that, hey, God ordained this. God permits Satan in this world and allows him to do a lot of things. And we know that from Job chapter 1 and 2. Okay, nonetheless, here he is writing back to the church, and he says in verse 2, we always, this good translation, this is written in the present tense. What does the present tense mean? Ongoing action. So the reason I want to bring that out is because when he says, we always thank God for you and continually mention you in our prayers. It doesn't mean that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, Paul's always praying. It means regularly, throughout the day, keeping a mindset of prayer. He was constantly, ongoing, right? It doesn't mean without any interruption. But anyway, when he's talking about his prayer life, but he's not just talking about his prayer life, he's sharing his prayer life. You notice he says, we. He introduces Paul, Silas, and Timothy, and it's as though again, I don't want to make too much of this, but I don't want to miss it either. He's not saying, hey, I'm praying for you all the time. He's saying, we're praying for you all the time. Well, what does that mean? Doesn't that mean that they're talking about what's going on there? You know, I think one of the great benefits of our prayer life is not just having prayer lists and praying about a lot of things, but talking to fellow Christians who are also praying about the same thing and sharing what you know so that we can pray more intelligently and encourage one another in our prayers. Because maybe I'm just saying this for my benefit, but I can't tell you how many times I'm so glad that people mention to me, by the way, Willie's not getting back till Wednesday night. I'm kind of like, I love Willie. I'm so concerned about Willie, but I haven't thought about Willie in 3 days. I'm glad you mentioned that. You know, because it brings to mind Willie. I want to pray for Willie again. And you know what? I probably would have gone another 2 or 3 days without praying for Willie if you hadn't said that. Now, you guys are probably better than me, but that happens to me all the time. And I am very grateful when people give me good gossip. Can I say that? Because I know gossip's wrong, and I don't mean this in the wrong sense. What I mean is, I'm glad when people talk about other people in a good way, or praying for, praying about, or what's going on. Helps me. I think we're reminded of that here when he says we. This is a corporate thing. This is a thing Christians do. We always thank God for you and continually mention your prayers. By the way, in just a minute, we're going to find out that one of the things that Paul says that's so good that they're doing there in the church is they're not just remembering the word and putting it into practice. They're also bringing to mind the example. The example that Paul set, that Silas set, that Timothy set. He says, you know what? You're trying to imitate us. It's a good thing. You know, he's going to say they did it effectively, and it's a good thing. When you keep that in the back of your mind, and he's writing to those kind of people, and he's saying, hey, by the way, we as together are praying for you. You know what? In all likelihood, it's going to happen. They're going to say, hey, Paul, Silas, they're praying together. Why don't we pray together? Right? He's giving them more of an example to follow. We've talked about this before. Remember the 3 levels? And I don't want to get hung up on this, but I think it's important to remember. You can call them levels, you can call them degrees, whatever you want to call them. But when we talk about authority, we talk about how do we know God wants us to do something. If God specifically says it or commands it, that's pretty clear, right? Let's call that level number 1. What would level number 2 be? Examples. Examples. Such as, why do we meet on the first day of the week? Can you find any command in the Bible that says you're supposed to meet on the first day of the week? I can't find a command. I find examples. I find examples. By the way, I do find a clear statement that says don't let anybody tell you you're supposed to keep the Sabbath day. That's in Colossians chapter 2. Okay, so if I find a verse that says don't do that, and I'm left hanging, and the Bible tells me I'm supposed to meet, well then, okay, what am I supposed to meet? I'm going to go to the example. Right? So you've got specifically what the Bible says are commands. You've got examples. What would the 3rd level be? Inferences. We call them inferences. Right? What is an inference?
Deductive assumption, reasoning, this must be right.
Yeah, since I already brought it up, let me go back to smoking.
Yeah.
There's no place in the Bible where it says Paul gave up his cigarettes, so you should too. It never says that. I'm glad we can have a little fun here. I'm having fun anyway. Okay, but why do we infer that you know what? If God were writing to the church today, he'd probably mention something like that. Why do we infer that?
Because he talks about our bodies being the temple of the Holy Spirit.
That'd be a great one. There's several places you could go, but that'd be a great one.
I was going to say in Philippians, Paul talks about, we call it to that purity test or whatever.
Yes, good. There in the 4th chapter, yeah. Okay, so there are a lot of things that you could point to and say, you know what? That just doesn't fit with doing this to your body, right? And you could apply it to a lot of things. That would be an inference. By the way, I think that would be a good inference, but it's taking biblical principles and applying them to situations that we're in. Okay, we're going to see a lot of that level 2 here. He's going to say some things, but he's going to talk a lot about the example and imitation of it. Verse 3, we remember before our God and Father your work. Let me read the whole verse because I'm going to get bogged down here. This is a great verse. We remember, he's talking about his prayer life, right? The prayers that they share. We remember before our God and Father your work produced by faith, your labor prompted by love, and your endurance inspired by hope in our Lord Jesus Christ. What are the three major things he focuses on there?
Labor, steadfast.
It seems like he's hitting faith, hope, and love. Does that
Yeah,
sound like
sounds
a
like it.
trinity that you've heard before? Faith, hope, and love? Doesn't the Bible say something about these three things endure, faith, hope, love, but the greatest of these is... Yeah, very good. That'd be 1 Corinthians chapter 13. By the way, it's not just 1 Corinthians chapter 13. You find this trinity, if you want to call it that, this threefold focus mentioned in several places. This is one of the clearer ones. I love this. It's as though, you know, you can communicate a message in a lot of different ways. What's the basic point he's making here? It's not about faith, hope, and love per se. I mean, that's part of it. But what he's really talking about here in this third verse is, hey, you're putting into practice what you believe, right? You're really living it out. So why use faith, hope, and love as your outline to hang that on? Well, you're not just talking about living out the Christian life. You're also reinforcing some Christian teaching at the same time, making your point. So he's accomplishing two different things here. Yeah, was that a hand or is that just a... Oh, yes.
It also says work, labor, and endurance.
Yeah! Well, let's go to those, because that's what I really want to tear apart. Because I think that's more of the content. He's just hanging it on faith, hope, and love. But let's look at those. He says, first of all, he says, your work produced by faith. This word for work is, by the way, the most common word for work in the New Testament, ergon, when we talk about works. When we talk about works, we talked about that a little bit Sunday, didn't we? This, by the way, is a very broad, general word for works. It can encompass a lot of things. I think he purposefully did that. You know why? Because if you really have faith, if you really, what's faith? A trusting kind of belief, people will be able to see that. By the way, what book in the New Testament hammers that point more than any other book? James. Say you believe, show it. Prove it. Let me see it. You know, works and faith are not the same thing, but if you have faith, I will see it in your works, right? Two different things, but nonetheless it'll be manifested that way. Okay, he uses a very broad term here, and I think he does that purposefully because if you really do trust in God, that's going to show itself in so many different ways, right? It may show itself in the way you vote. It may show itself in the way you spend your money. It may show itself in what you do with your free time. It may show itself in just being a morally good person. You know, picking up that stuff that somebody else dropped at the grocery store, even when you didn't have to. Just general stuff like that, because it's a broad term, talks about any kind of good deed. Yeah.
We've talked about the word, well, you have glory.
Yeah, wait.
So, do you think somebody could be faithful, but not give God having a lot of glory or the weight of God in their life?
Ultimately, no, I don't.
Okay.
However, I think everybody has to grow into what a Christian really should be.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's possible, maybe a period of your life before you get there. But I think if you really understand this, he has to have priority. Has to. In fact, look at the very next expression. Because he doesn't just say this work produced by faith, work produced by faith. He says labor prompted by love. What's the difference between work and labor? Especially if you know the word for work just means broad category, any kind of thing you do.
Well, labor is going to be an exertion. You're working hard. You're perspiring.
Yes. Here's the main. There's a lot of distinction, but it's kind of like if you were to outline this, work would be the broad category. A sub segment. I'm losing my terms here, but a subset. That's what I wanted to say. Of that would be labor, because labor would be the kind of stuff that hurts you, costs you, right? It perspired, energy involved. You can do a lot of work that, you know what, that wasn't anything. That was just, in fact, sometimes as a preacher, there are things that I do that it took a lot of work and people didn't realize it. But a lot of times I get thanked for stuff and people just pat me on the back and I think to myself, that was nothing. you know what I mean? Because on my part, but nonetheless, sometimes it doesn't cost you a lot. It doesn't require much of you, and it's still something important you ought to do, right? But in addition to that, he talks about this labor. Well, what does that mean? Well, sorry, but this is the one that just keeps coming to mind. Let's go back to giving. When the Bible talks about giving, what's one of the major points being made about, if you're asking yourself, how much should I give? How much should I give? Well, if you're going to do a study of this, you're going to look through some of the famous passages, like in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9. You got to go to a passage like that. That just talks about it more than any other place in the New Testament. One of the things you're going to find is sacrifice. Sacrifice. So what does that mean? Well, for one person, giving $10 on a particular week, that may have been, wow, I don't know how you did that. You made a sacrifice. Somebody else giving $1,000 one week, you know what? You didn't do what you should have done, because that was nothing to you. You know what I mean? And by the way, that's one of the things that the Bible's point is making. It's proportional. It's going to be something different for everybody. But the point is, it has to get into this area. Okay, I don't want to just stick at giving, though, because it's not just giving. If I really, what does it say here? Labor prompted by what?
Love.
What is, give me the definition of agape?
What's best?
It's best
A
for the other
commitment
person. There you
for
go.
what is best for the person loved. So if I'm really committed to doing what's best for that person that I'm expressing love for, you know what? Sometimes it's going to cost me. You know what? It's going to cut into my free time. It's going to cut into what I'd rather be doing. It's going to hurt. It may cost me financially. It may not cost me financially at all, but it's going to cost me some way if I really love somebody, right? In fact, it may be doing something I don't really want to do that. You know what I mean? But I'm going to do it anyway because I know that's good for the people involved, especially when we're talking about within the family of God. Okay, work produced by faith, love, labor prompted by love, and endurance. What's the idea? Do you have a different word for endurance here? Steadfast. That'd be good. Inspired by what? Hope in our Lord. What does that mean? What's the hope in our Lord Jesus Christ?
Basically the promise that he's coming back.
Yeah, okay. There's several different levels you can take that, but that's a major one. A major one is not just that what he said is true. I mean, you could go out at that point. What he says is true, and I know it's true, so I know this is the right way to live. That's what my hope's in, because I get the truth from him. But more specifically, I also know that there's going to be a day where I have to give an account for this. There's going to be a judgment day. There's going to be eternity. Since I know that's coming, I can keep on doing what I know is right, which sometimes I'd rather not do, right? Because it hurts. It costs me. Yeah.
I don't know, I started thinking it might be more of, gee, there's that light at the end of the tunnel, I can see
Yes.
the goal.
Yes.
Because it helps you to keep doing what you're doing and not become weary of it because of your hope.
Yes. You know, I had the pleasure of talking to somebody after church Sunday who had a family member die this past year. And they're saying, I just can't get over it. I just can't look at life the same way that I used to. And I said, I'm so glad. I'm so glad. And I really meant it talking to this person, because you know what? Having your eyes open to the fact that my loved ones are going to die. I'm going to die. This life's going to be over. Everybody should be looking at life that way. Colossians 3, verses 1 through 4, keep your eyes fixed on heaven. What's the number one metaphor? Not the number one. What's a metaphor used from the Old Testament to describe our lives here and now? It's the wilderness experience. What's the idea of the wilderness? It's not where you live. It's just some place you're trying to get through. You're going to the promised land. This is not our home. It's one of the things we keep in mind. I've gone over my time, haven't I? Sorry about that. Okay, so we're ready to start with verse 4 next week, right? Can I borrow a pencil and a clicker? Brooks? Appreciate it. Yep. All right, I want to talk to you guys for just a minute right after class, okay?